Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Mary Beth Gallagher. We're pleased to have our webinar this afternoon to discuss our new report for the Shifting Gears Investor Engagement with the Automotive Industry. A reminder that we have a question and answer box at the bottom of the screen, so please feel free to insert any questions. We'll have a Q&A section at the end of the conversation. Marcia, welcome. Just to confirm, is the audio all set?
It's okay for me. I heard well.
Yeah.
Good.
Great. Welcome. Great. So without further ado, welcome everyone to our webinar. We have 3 excellent panelists today to discuss our new report on the Shifting Gears Investor Engagement launched by Investor Advocates for Social Justice. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to launch our PowerPoint deck and hope that that comes through clearly for everyone. Great. Thanks so much. So you will hear today from a great list of speakers. I'm going to first provide some background and context about the Shifting Gears engagement and our history of advocacy with the automotive industry. We've been focused on 23 companies on behalf of our affiliates, Investor Advocates for Social Justice, really focused on addressing human rights impacts in the automotive industry. After me, we'll hear from Sarah Murphy, who conducted research. Thanks, Sarah. Conducted research to support the new report. She is a senior consultant at Sustainable Investments Institute and has over 20 years of experience advising institutional investors and businesses on aligning their portfolios with environmental and social objectives. After Sarah, we'll hear from Marcia Silva, Director of the Institute for the National Pact to Eradicate Slave Labor, also known as Impacto, based in Brazil. Marcia is the Executive Director of Impacto, which involves the private sector and the public sector working to eradicate slavery in the supply chain. Her initiative is a partnership among companies, civil society, and has support from the U.S. government and the ILO in Brazil. And finally, we'll hear from Terry Collingsworth, Executive Director of IRA Advocates, International Rights Advocates, who will speak about litigation that he's leading, focused on addressing child labor in DRC's cobalt mines. Finally, we'll finish with discussion of the recommendations and call to action in our report and leave some time for Q&A at the end. Great. So brief overview of Investor Advocates for Social Justice. We're a community of faith-based institutional investors. We're based in Montclair, New Jersey, and we use our faith-based values to promote human rights, climate justice, racial equity, and the common good through our investments. Our organization represents and works in partnership alongside our affiliates in shareholder engagements with companies in their investment portfolio. As part of our approach, we're committed to doing stakeholder outreach and engagement to help inform our investor analysis and our investment advocacy. I'll speak about the Shifting Gears initiative. So this is an initiative we launched in 2018 to focus on a concerted, coordinated investor engagement to address human rights impacts in a sector where there's broad research demonstrating that this is a high-risk area. Many of our affiliates hold that a list of automotive companies in their portfolio, and we thought this was an opportunity for us to use our collective investor voice to address human rights risks in automotive company operations and supply chains. Our engagements have focused on 23 companies, including OEMs, automotive companies, Tier 1 suppliers, and an auto parts company. What we do through this strategy is reinforce the expectations of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, which recognize that all companies and investors have a responsibility to respect human rights and to carry that out through human rights due diligence. We use several investor strategies in our approach, including investor letters, shareholder dialogue, and shareholder proposals. And we welcome other investors throughout investor networks like ICCR and the Investor Alliance for Human Rights to join us in these engagements. Why did we focus on the automotive industry? The automotive industry is exposed to a broad list of salient human rights risks, from child labor and forced labor, worker health and safety risks in heavy manufacturing, high risk of worker hour and wage violations. There's issues related to freedom of association and collective bargaining. There have been incidents of harassment and discrimination. The supply chain includes operations in conflict-affected areas where raw materials are sourced. There's an obvious link between the automotive industry and as a key driver for climate change, and there are risks of environmental health degradation. And at this moment, I think we're all looking at how COVID-19 and the coronavirus pandemic are impacting our personal lives and our professional lives. And in the industry, there's been significant disruption in manufacturing, which places supply chain partners under economic pressure and also presents risks for the health and safety of workers in manufacturing and the supply chain. There's a question about the slides. I'll definitely share the slides with the group after the conversation. So just to orient us towards the broad range of risks and how they factor into the car, I'll talk for a second about the commodity supply chain. And all of these commodities highlighted in the slide are ones where there's a research documented risk of these commodities being mined, produced, manufactured, using forced labor, child labor, or under poor working conditions. This includes cobalt that goes into the lithium-ion battery, a commodity that's going to be under increasing demand as we transition to electric vehicles. Charcoal and iron ore, pig iron components that are used to make steel for the car chassis, rubber in the tires of the car, or cattle that's raised for leather and seating. And there are really well-documented reports produced by Amnesty International and SOMO, as well as the Department of Labor and ILO, that really demonstrate how prevalent these risks are in these commodities. And what we want to know in our engagement as investors is how companies are addressing those risks and how aware they are of them. We talked a little bit about the impact of COVID-19, but as it increases the pressure on this sector and all the economy, we really need to think about and focus on the most vulnerable workers. There's risks of getting COVID-19 in a heavy manufacturing setting as companies, at least in the US, begin to reopen operations. And supply chain partners are more vulnerable to risks of forced labor and child labor if there's competing demands on the supply chain. We really need to think about how to create a resilient business model that respects human rights in times of crisis as well as in times of the steady state. So we've been conducting this engagement with the companies for 2 years now, and we recognize that through our engagements, practices are not as robust and effective as we feel like they need to be in order to address these severe human rights impacts. And we wanted to bring a data-driven approach to our engagement so we can really focus on where companies were exposed to the greatest risk, where they may be lagging peers, where they have opportunities to really step up. So we conducted this report in partnership with Sustainable Investments Institute with Sarah as our research partner. And it includes profiles of 21 companies going into great detail on their human rights policies and governance structures. We have analysis that goes into greater detail of some of the human rights risks I just mentioned, forced labor, child labor, and where they manifest. We talk about our role as investors. How can we and must we be engaging to address human rights with our portfolio companies? And finally, we conclude with recommendations for companies on how to take up the expectations of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights and really improve their practices. The report includes an analysis of all of the companies listed here, so 21 companies, including OEMs and suppliers. And I'll highlight just a few key findings, and Sarah will go into greater depth. But first, governance of human rights is weak. This is something that stood out across all companies. Board level expertise and oversight of human rights is really absent. And what we know from our advocacy with companies is that the tone at the top is really important for setting in place a good system to address human rights or any important risk for a company. Many companies scored poorly on the point about embedding respect for human rights throughout the business. So it's talking about how they factor in human rights criteria into everyday business decisions, such as procurement. There was very weak disclosure across the board on that. And I'll highlight one final point about traceability and supply chain risks. Just given the number of commodities in a car and the extensive nature of the supply chain, transparency and traceability with strong monitoring mechanisms for the supply chain is especially important, but we noticed that was weak across the board. So with this just brief glimpse from the report, we'll turn to Sarah, who will go into greater depth, and then we'll hear from Marcia and Terry. Thanks.
Thanks, Gina. Yeah, so as Gina mentioned, I am here on behalf of the Sustainable Investments Institute, SI2, and we provide impartial research on organized efforts to influence corporate behavior around social and environmental issues. So for our role in this report, we developed a methodology. It was our endeavor not to reinvent the wheel. There are many good frameworks out there already that consider how human rights plays out in the automotive sector. And so in developing this methodology, we consulted existing frameworks that included the United Nations Guiding Principles Reporting Framework, the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, the Core UNGP Indicator Assessment, Know the Chain Benchmark, and the OECD Due Diligence Guidance, among others. So from consulting those existing frameworks, we built an assessment of the companies based on 7 human rights themes. Those include human rights policy, human rights governance and embedding, supplier code of conduct, traceability and supply chain transparency, human rights due diligence and embedding, remedies and grievance mechanisms, and participation or leadership in multi-stakeholder initiatives. It's a pretty ambitious framework that we developed. So from that, we provided a scoring system. So number one, top performers by those indicators, and it went from 1 to 3, with 3 being the lowest. And we have included in this report our qualitative findings under each individual company profile, and those correlate directly to the quantitative scoring that we provided. And you'll see that in our final scorecard, companies received a red light, yellow light, green light assessment that correlates with that 1 to 3 scoring. And we drew the data that we had from public disclosures, reports from NGOs, various news articles and such. We also sent our findings to the companies for feedback, and we got almost no responses. So we're relying on the public information. So from the scoring, you'll see on the next slide, the rankings that we came up with. So that 1.8 for BMW being the highest and the 2.9 for Denso being the lowest. And each one of these companies has profiles within the report itself that goes into detail about how we arrived at these scores. Overall findings for the reporting itself, we can go to the next slide, Mary Beth. Oh, pardon me, before I get to that. A couple of overall calculations that we did against this. We found that OEMs did slightly better than suppliers on their average overall scores. And if you look at the graph, you can see where some of the better and worse performances were based on the particular area of evaluation. Companies generally did better when it came to having policies in place, having articulated some form of policy both for their own operations and for their suppliers. And they tended to score lower when it came to governance and implementation and being able to actually demonstrate how those policies played out in a practical manner. So now we can move to the next slide. You can see some of the regional trends. Oh, pardon. So in general, we found that the European companies performed slightly better on most of the themes, with the US and Japan largely tracking each other, but the Japan doing worse in some areas as well. So our overall findings were effectively that there's very little board level oversight of human rights in general, and almost no evidence of how existing policies are implemented, how they play out, how they actually work from a practical standpoint. So, and we also, when it comes to governance, there were very few companies that demonstrated that they had, say, a board member with human rights qualifications, or and some will say that they do, but it's not substantiated in that board member's bio or history when you look into it. So that's another concern, is that some companies say that, for instance, having experience as a CEO of another company confers such expertise, but we were looking for a higher threshold when it came to specific qualifications around human rights. We found that sustainability committees often were referenced as evidence of good governance of human rights, but that there was no specific detail around how those committees addressed human rights itself as an issue. Companies also provided almost no evidence of implementation of the policies that they articulated. So some of them had really quite robust policies in place, but there was little evidence as to how that went into practice. So for instance, few provided detailed disclosure on supplier audits and the results of those audits, for instance. Even fewer disclosed how they remedied action, if they found problems in their supply chain, how did they address those problems? And we know from media reports and significant research into this industry that problems exist. So it cannot be the case that audits come up clean if they're being done effectively. So there was very little evidence as to how difficulties were addressed when they were exposed. We also found that companies continue to avoid binding or clear commitments about human rights in their value chains. I have to say that we found that companies largely engaged in what I call verbal gymnastics when it comes to articulating their human rights commitments, especially when they're referencing some of the international frameworks or conventions that I mentioned earlier when we were developing our methodology. And in fact, the corporate human rights benchmark addresses this specific problem in its discussion on the wording of policy commitments, and it mentions that researchers should look for very explicit commitments and watch out for vague or weak wording. And more often than not, what we found was vague or weak wording. And in many cases, we found sometimes hundreds of pages of disclosure on this topic, only to realize that at the heart of it was effectively just a bare minimum of legal compliance. So communications are a little bit nebulous around this topic. We also found that most policies appear to be reactionary to negative press. And so many of the frameworks that we reference in our methodology, it's sort of going the opposite direction from what would be considered ideal. So rather than a company conducting an overall assessment of its human rights risks and then implementing policies to deal with those risks, rather it appeared that negative press came up and policies were put in place to sort of quell the flames around that press. So it's sort of going against the grain from what would be considered an optimal approach. That being said, some of the disclosure that is responsive to legal requirements reveals a little bit of what's possible. So we had, for instance, we've got the conflict minerals rule under Dodd-Frank, we've got the UK Modern Slavery Act, we've got California Transparency and Supply Chains Act, and the disclosures a company provide under those frameworks demonstrate what they're able to do. And some companies have started to use those particular disclosure requirements to expand them beyond legal compliance. For instance, cobalt is not required for disclosure under the conflict minerals rule, but some are starting to do that. But in general, we found that supplier monitoring is missing teeth. So we see, for instance, that there's very limited visibility, particularly for raw materials that have complex supply chains. with numerous tiers and intermediaries. And reflecting what Mary Beth said in her introduction, it's notable that some of the challenges that we've seen in this same industry around COVID-19 and the challenges that we see around human rights monitoring are the same in that they arise from a poor understanding of one's supply chain. And so I think that there's something quite interesting to tease out of that the better you know the full length of your chain and what's happening along it, the more resilient you are to the various shocks that come into play, whether it's bad press on the human rights level or a global pandemic. So, and then just further to that point, we also saw in general a lack of systems that monitor whether direct suppliers are cascading their human rights expectations down to sub-suppliers. So many of the companies in the research universe did have policies for their tier 1 suppliers, but very few brought that down further along the chain itself. We also found that grievance mechanisms are fairly limited. Many companies have a hotline of some sort in place with various degrees of quality to those hotlines, but in general, few had a system that might truly encourage ready and confident reporting of human rights abuses from any entity who might be in a position to observe those. And so those were the overall findings that we had, and the report gets into more detail about how those played out in individual companies. But I think I'll stop there and yield to Marcia.
Thanks so much, Sarah. So now, Marcia, we'll turn to you, and I'll walk to your slides, and if there's a point where you want to show the video, just let me know. So again, Marcia Silva, the Executive Director of Impacto, over to you.
Oh, thank you for this invitation. Good afternoon to all. And I'm very glad to be here. And I have to react for some of these findings, of course, because it's interesting. Usually companies design wonderful policies, but it's very expensive to put them in place. Thinking about the size of Brazil, if one company decide to really visit 2 of them, their suppliers, the airplane ticket is very expensive. So they make sure that the policy is okay, but they don't put money to make that policy works. So it's important to understand that human rights is still directions without budget inside of many companies. So that's why they have a lot of these verbal like gymnastics. I like that because they have to say they agree, but they don't have how to implement it because it's not in the budget. And we are now facing the world, one situation where everybody stops. So we have a kind of a break, and that break is showing how we are broken, how society are vulnerable, how racism, sexism is there. So for me, that make that presentation from years, I think now is going to make sense, because to understand the situation now, we have to look many centuries ago. So how to talk about modern slavery in Brazil now? I am invite you guys to open your eyes and empathy, because there's a lot to learn. It's not easy, it's not simple, and took a lot of time and goodwill to make partnership and to really push without make only guilting or just pressure without walk together. So next slide, please. Again, going to the subject. So we know Brazil was one of the biggest countries that bring the Africans as slavery, as a slave from Africa. So they are free people over there, and then they became slaves here. And the data is terrible. 5.5 million were captured, and just 4.8 arrived here alive. We are responding for almost 40% of all the African people that come from Africa, only Brazil. So it's a lot of people. In that time, they are considered adults from 12 to 13 years and used to work from 6 to 10 p.m. And they age very quickly, and they get sick and they die. it's not so much different right now. Next slide. So, but in that time, they are treated better because they are part of their property. They are commodity. So they have a better condition than now. Because today, if the employee just use all the power of that person, and that person is not producing anymore, they just let them go or let them die. So Brazil used and became rich or became what we are, all based in slavery. The coffee, the sugar starts in the 1600s, coffee near to the 1700s, and even the textile industry that is all over the world with the same issue of lack of good salaries, exploitation of a woman, child labor. In Brazil, they start still during our slavery time. We just abolished this slave in 1988, just yesterday. And we are seeing now on the streets the results of that. In Brazil was knowledge in the world as a country that we live together happy, we are not discriminated, we don't have a neighborhood of white or neighborhood of black, we have a racial democracy. That's a lie. In UNESCO, in 1915, just discovered that. That is a lie, that was a propaganda. So in the government of Fernando Henrique Cardoso in 1995, for the first time, Brazil assumes that we have all this problem, racism, sexism, slavery, and child labor. 1995. Until there, our government just denied. How can we implement public policies? How can you create an institutionality to fight against those kind of crime if you deny the existence of that? So we are pretty young to deal with those kind of issues. Next one. So 400 years of slavery making people believe on this very tough hierarchy. Someone believes they are inferior. The job or the conditions is there. It's like that for centuries. How I change that? Because I never saw something different. And the church do the same, and the rich people repeated that. The TV repeated that. The fashion industry repeated that. So we are growing up in a country that really designing people to obey and to see themselves in a different situation, in looking for different opportunity of work or study related with your background. We have more than half of the population as African descendants, African American, African Brazilian descendants. Next, please. So the UK Act and the California Act was starting 2014, 12. We started dealing with that in supply chain in 1995. When the Brazilians starts to understand the problem, we created this mobile inspection group. So we are a long time talk with company about their situation on their supply chain. And the situation was so big that in 1997, we created the dirty list. And in 2003, we start to talking about this national plan as a politics inside of the big companies in the supply chain. So the dirty list is a famous tool that everybody knows in Brazil, outside of Brazil. It's a database with the results of the inspections, and in there is the name of the person or the company that was exploited slavery or exploited workers in the conditions like slavery. And that is part of a penal code. It's not in the labor law, it's in penal code law. So it's in a different point of prosecution officers. So you have two lines of execution. Go to the administrative way and go to the criminal way. That's why those people get very mad when they go to the dirty list, because they have to answer in two directions. Next, please. We know that Brazil has also a very intense contest. We have civil society engaged. We have a lot of data. We have media. And for a few years ago, we have a lot of legislation. Now we are losing some of them. But we still have a very positive environment to debate, dialogue, and to push against slavery. Again, please. Next one. Yeah. People say that we have a different slave label definition. It's not that different from the ILO definition. The point is, we took the ILO index, the degradation working condition, and debilitating or arduous working day. We took these two indicators and make them become pillar, and make those four situations be part of our legislation. So people are going to jail if they have a criminal penalty, but because of slavery, and also they have their land expropriation. That we gained in 2014. We put our legislation inside of the constitutions saying about that land expropriation. That's why we are fighting a lot with the big guys, usually those that owns a lot of land. Next, please. And I think I'm going to accelerate it again, one more. So, Impacto is an NGO that was creating among companies. We started the National Pact in 2005. Companies says, okay, it's enough. Let's put some commercial or economic punishment to our suppliers if they are going to the dirty list. Let's look at the dirty list first before doing business. So they started doing this kind of pact, and then became a huge, almost 400 companies together. And they discovered that they have few information about human rights, about slavery, child labor, and zero information about how to do. So they create Impacto, the institute that is really trying to bring technical information, technical assistance, data. And we are trying to engage people, because it's not only a problem of one company or one government, it's a collective problem. It was created a long time ago. This inequality that people exploited now, it's not now, it's have a long roots. So you have to look for that, and look for that with a very good plan, and a lot of people work together. Next. So we try to generate information. Those companies are our principal supporters right now. They are trying to do hard work on supporting Impact to go deep, but we have 48 companies associated with Impacto. Next. I don't want to approach you with this why human rights and supply chain is important, because it's just so on the report, so we can go and put the video. Before I go to the video, we create an index that take in consideration the region, because the companies usually, they are not alone in one region, and the vulnerability of the population is inside of the region. If they immigrate or not, if they have a job or not. So we stop thinking about one company or one sector, and we're talking about one local. So everybody can come together. That's why we developed this index. And we have a video, 4 minutes. And I wish you guys could see this video, because it's more explain better what we are doing. Could be? I hope so.
Sure, Marcia, just given the time, I'm going to send the video to the participants after and encourage everyone to review the video. I'm sorry that we won't show it now, but we'll show it in follow-up. And like Marcia says, it gives a good overview of Impacto and the new vulnerability index that they've been developing. I wondered, Marcia, if you could touch on, for just a few minutes, about the commodities related to the automotive industry, where where they're sourced from Brazil, where there are risks of forced labor or child labor, and the extent to which the automotive companies are participating in any of your work?
Unfortunately, the automobile company is not part of Impacto. We are invited them for many times, many years, since 2005. We have many conversations because they use leather from the cattle. And we know that the cattle have a huge problem with exploitation. They create a moratorium. So the cattle industry tries to monitor them, but the industry is out. And we know that the industry also take advantage of the iron pig. And inside of the iron pig, we have the charcoal, the vegetable charcoal, use a lot of slavery. So all these small components are vulnerable and are exploited, but the automobile are so far away in the line of the chain, they feel they are not responsible for that. In the middle, they have big other companies, so they are going on the shadow of those companies. There is some suppliers or some components of the car that usually is not even famous. We have the Carnaúba wax that became an international scandal because of the Haribo candy. The Haribo candy used the Carnaúba wax to make them bright and not smelt in the hand. Carnaúba goes to chocolates, lipsticks, and also to make the car shining. Carnaúba goes inside of every cell phone. And Carnaúba is only made in Brazil, in 5 regions, 5 states. So it's very easy to contain if you look from the region. And the automobile never come to talk about that. So they are always, unfortunately, get silent when you're talking about this human rights violation and many components of their industry. So unfortunately, I don't have so much of good practice to say from those companies.
Thanks, Marcia, for that really good historical context for the working conditions and history of slavery in Brazil, and also that clear invitation to the automotive industry to engage with Impacto, given the complexity of the issues and the high-risk commodities that are sourced in Brazil, to really engage in this cross-sectoral partnership to address sourcing from companies associated with the quote-unquote dirty list, to really understand where workers may be exploited and at risk of forced labor and child labor. So thank you so much, Marcia.
Thank you.
And finally, we'll turn to you, Terry, to speak about your work. Terry Collingsworth from International Rights Advocates, over to you.
Thanks very much, Mary Beth, and thanks for organizing this program. I'm happy to talk to a different audience than I normally do. The main thing I want to talk about here is that my organization specializes in suing multinational companies that are violating human rights in the global economy. We have recently engaged in a lawsuit against Tesla, Apple, Google, Microsoft, and Dell for using cobalt coming from the DRC that is mined by artisanal miners, many of whom are children. This has been widely documented in recent years, lots of media showing just the horrible conditions that face these miners. Typically what happens to them is that they are working without any protective equipment at all, not even good shoes. They're wearing like flip-flops, and they're given a shovel and they start digging in these loose shale rocks. They dig tunnels in to bring the cobalt rocks out. There's no supportive beams provided, nothing at all in the way of safety equipment. The air is hazardous. They're stirring up dust that has carcinogens and other hazardous chemicals. And then almost routinely, I'm afraid to say, the cobalt mines collapse. There's no beams, it's just loose rock. And then the miners are killed or maimed. And often it's not even it's not reported. There's not much of a free press in the DRC. And I've interviewed some moms who didn't even get the bodies of their children back because they were buried very deeply in these collapsed tunnels. And I would say categorically, no one who has looked at this for more than 10 minutes, did a little bit of research, would be able to deny that this is the reality of artisanal miners in the DRC. I went there by the invitation of a couple of local groups to see if we could take this horrific practice that everyone knows about and turn it into a lawsuit. And I interviewed a bunch of families, and I ended up finding 14 different families whose children were either killed or maimed in a mine collapse, and in where the mines could be traced to the companies that we have sued. I have a few pictures to show you of some of the plaintiffs and their injuries, just to put this in a human context, to let you see like what anyone who goes there could find out if they tried. Can you show those, please? This is a typical tunnel. There's a little stick in the front of it, the only brace I've ever seen, and that's how small they are. It's good for kids because they can crawl inside them. Next. These are three of the plaintiffs that we have, three of the claimants that we represent. Clearly, they've suffered serious injuries. These were all in mine collapses. The boy on the left has one crushed leg, and there's an iron bar in the other leg. The healthcare is just so primitive there. They're probably going to have more infections. The middle boy lost his leg. Obviously, it was amputated. It was smashed completely. And then the last boy, he has one leg that is completely smashed with a metal pole in it, and the other one, they're not sure if they're going to be able to save it. And I want to stress, I didn't look for like the worst cases. This is just normal. These were among the many people who showed up. And I've been doing this work for 38 years, and it was the worst thing I've ever seen. There was a line of maimed children waiting to talk to me when I showed up there. That's what we're dealing with when these companies, the richest companies in the world, are getting their cobalt from the DRC. So we sued them. We picked 5. We could sue all of the auto companies and all of the electronic companies. We just need a little bit more time to work on tracing their supply chains. They're all doing the same thing. I would have done that already, but then the COVID quarantine started, and now they have an Ebola outbreak there. So it'll be a bit before we can get back. But I want to say to anybody there from any of these companies or that are working with them, we're going after all of them. This is the worst thing that I've seen in my years, and there's no excuse for it. So I want to explain briefly what the legal theory is and how I think it's going to be quite easy to hold them accountable and anyone else who doesn't fix their supply chain in the cobalt area. We are mainly suing under the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act. I'm not going to get too legal easy. I'm just going to explain what the elements are. First, we have to show that there was forced or trafficked child labor. Now, in all of these cases, I think we have both. Typically, the kids are not able to go to school because the government charges $6 a month for fees, school fees, so they can't afford it. They don't go to school, and then the only work in this area is the cobalt mine. So they show up, and they usually get corralled by what I will call a labor broker who takes them to a particular place, gives them a shovel, and says, go to work. And then typically that guy steals most of what they would have earned if they knew any better, and then gives them really just enough money, literally $1 or $2 a day for risking their lives to be able to eat enough to come back the next day and work. It's slavery, but they get to go home at night. And that's really the new slavery of the world. And I see that several people are nodding their head knowing that, yeah, that's really how it works now. So we have that, I think, is trafficking. And then there's also coercion in the forced labor, because they're told, like, if they don't work faster, they're not going to be able to come at all, and they're going to starve, and their families are going to starve. And I'm going to make an argument here that I've not seen in any other case yet, that these are all children, and under any national legal system, including the US, and I imagine in the DRC, I will look into that, children can't consent to anything. They can't consent to quitting school. They can't consent to getting married. So how in the world are they able to consent to do dangerous work that's going to kill them or maim them? So I don't think that there could ever be consent to go work under these dangerous conditions. And we're also going to argue there's no question that the ILO Convention 182 that states the worst forms of child labor. These are even worse than the worst forms of child labor, and that should be a per se violation of forced labor for children. So that's the gateway showing we have to make, that these kids were forced or trafficked to go work. Then there are three simple elements to the statute. We have to show that the companies participated in a venture. Now, that venture does not have to be a legal agreement. It's just an association in fact, and we're alleging with pretty good details that the entire cobalt supply chain is a venture. They're all working together. They're cooperating for the end product to be delivered to these companies that are receiving the finished cobalt refined. So that's the first step. There just has to be a venture. The second step is that the venture has to receive a benefit from the forced labor. And we've alleged that, yeah, it's a lot cheaper to get cobalt from kids who are being paid $1 a day than it would be if you had to pay, let's say, a union mine worker who had health and safety, good pay, and got to go home every day. That's a benefit. It's very cheap because of the conditions. And then the third factor we have to show is that the companies knew about the forced labor. And here in our complaint, which is on our website, which is www.iradvocates.org. It's about 100 and some pages with lots of pictures. But we detail in the complaint the level of knowledge for each of the companies. There's been a lot of press reports going back 2015, 16, when there was this explosion of demand for cobalt. 70% of it is in the DRC. Suddenly everyone started paying attention. Washington Post, The Guardian. If you have a pulse and you're looking into your supply chain, you'd know that this is a serious problem going on in the DRC cobalt mines. We also show that Amnesty with Africa Watch and Amnesty did a tremendous study in 2016 that's referenced on our website, where they actually went to the companies and asked them about their supply chains. And as either Sarah or Mary Beth mentioned earlier, cobalt is not a conflict mineral yet, so their reporting obligations about it are lesser than for some of the other minerals. But companies like Microsoft, which is a supplier to many of the auto industry participants, Microsoft said things like, well, it's too hard to monitor the cobalt production line. And Amnesty asked them point blank and reproduced some of these interviews and said, well, is it any harder than your other minerals? No, of course it's not. It's just that they don't have to do it yet. No one's made them do it, so they're not doing it. So we have lots of evidence of knowledge. And I think the best evidence we have is that each of these companies, because of public pressure, as Sarah was discussing, they were responding to crisis. So they issued these policies that clearly say, oh, we are so against child labor, no suppliers allowed to do it, but there's absolutely no monitoring of it. And many of them have these complaint mechanisms that we picked Apple's as the best example. We mock it in the complaint because Apple created this very complicated system where you can log onto their website and issue a complaint in writing, and then they'll tell you who's going to respond to that complaint. And it's like, that's so cynical. It would be funny if it were just like something that you were discussing you might do. It's real. That's their complaint mechanism. And these children who can't even read and certainly don't have computers or cell phones are told that, don't worry, if you see something, you can log onto our website and complain. That's how evil these companies are behaving in this particular instance. So I think we can satisfy these elements, and I think we can do it pretty easily. And I am looking forward to continuing with this lawsuit. I want to say a couple of other things about sort of our hopes and our objectives here. That when we filed this, I thought that maybe I've been doing this kind of work for years, and I've sued oil companies. Typically, the oil companies, they hire a big law firm and they'll say, we'll fight this till you're dead. We'll fight it forever, because they don't care really about their public image for the most part. I thought when we sued Apple and Tesla and Google and Microsoft and Dell that they might be more concerned that their consumer base is going to not like this, that they're going to think like, wow, I just paid $70,000 for a Tesla that I thought was green and wonderful. It's a perfect product where look, I can drive this Tesla and show what a great environmentally sensitive person I am. when in fact, ironically, it is based on the most fundamental abuse of human rights. The lithium battery requires cobalt. 70% is involved in this horrible human rights tragedy. And so these companies are touting their wokeness, their greenness, and all of these other things, but they are hiding from the consumers that it's based on this horrible human rights crime. So we thought that these companies would want to engage in a dialogue. We had a very specific list of demands that are in the complaint and that we've informally and formally made aware to the public and to the companies. We want to impose some kind of monitoring and certification system so that we can identify who is mining the cobalt and who is putting it in the bags. I note that several of these companies that we have sued, and then Ford and Daimler in particular, are touting blockchain and other tech things that are going to allow them to trace the cobalt all the way back to the supply chain source, to the particular vehicle or gadget or wherever it's going. Well, in fact, that is complete nonsense. It is really just a public relations ploy because they're not monitoring who's putting the stuff in the bag. So I'll grant you that it's possible to take a bag full of cobalt and use blockchain or just GPS coordinates and track that bag all the way up to refining, where they often cheat and mix it, but still you could do it if you wanted to the purchaser, Tesla or Ford or Daimler. But they're not monitoring who's putting the stuff in the bag. Well, we had a look, and it's children and other adult miners who are working under horrific conditions who are doing that. So that was part one of our demand. We need monitoring and certification of what goes in the bag. And then second, we wanted to see some rehabilitation and education programs for the children who have been injured and their families, because these companies have been profiting from this for quite some time, this abuse of people. And then last, we thought we should get some reparations for kids like you saw in the pictures who've been maimed. Instead, the companies have just simply lawyered up. They've hired the biggest law firms in the world. I'm facing 5 giant law firms for 5 companies. And we've shown other companies, we'll do this for years and years, but we're going to now launch a consumer campaign. They're not going to try to fix this problem with their enormous wealth. We want to see consumers learn about what they're doing and, more important, what they're not doing, and hope that that will shame these companies into taking action. But I want to stress again as I close that we picked the first 5 companies based on what information we had, and we're going to look at every single car company and electronics company that's participating in this horrific human rights crime and doing nothing about it. Thank you.
Harry, thank you so much for sharing about your work and really framing the gravity of the situation, and also importantly, the legal risk companies are facing if they fail to take meaningful and effective steps. As investor stakeholders, this is a concern for us, not only from a human rights perspective, but from a business risk perspective in terms of companies exposed to legal risk, reputational risk, and brand damage. So in the report, we cite instances like what Terry and Marcia have gone through about working conditions in the supply chain, and make the case that companies need more effective, stronger systems in place. I encourage you to review the report to further dive into the recommendations. I'll finish with a call to action to investor colleagues. There are shareholder proposals coming up this season focused on some of the companies assessed in the report. Lear Corporation, a leather and seatings company, already had its shareholder meeting, and our proposal there on human rights impact assessment did quite well, getting support from 44.76% of investors. General Motors has its AGM coming up just next week, where we're asking for a report on human rights policy implementation, really getting to the question of how does what you have on paper work in practice, how effective is it, and how are you implementing it? And then finally, Tesla, one of the companies subject to litigation that Terry just described, has a human rights disclosure resolution coming up for a vote on its July 7th AGM. So we encourage all investors to support those proposals on the proxy and to reach out to us if you have any questions about them. We have the Q&A box, and just will invite people for the last couple of minutes if there are any questions that you want to raise up. One thing that I didn't cover in depth was just the nature of our investor engagement. So we've had dialogues with 15 of the 23 companies and had over 40 dialogues with those companies over the course of the last 2 years. Sarah had done outreach, as she mentioned, when she was doing the research. And if Sarah, you wanted to talk a little bit about that. So one of the questions was about why the companies didn't reply, if that's something that we should be concerned or surprised about. So yeah. Sarah, if you want to talk about.
Yeah, real quick. First, I'll say, as a researcher, that's not terribly uncommon. It really depends on who's contacting them and why, and so it's not so unusual. And notice the difference between, so Mary Beth and Gina did have some success in engaging with companies when their objective was to have a dialogue and, you know, work to talk about possible modifications to company policy, right? In my case, basically, I was sending them a confirmation of public information, and I specifically said, you know, if what you send me back doesn't qualitatively alter in a substantive way what we have here, then, you know, so they may have just determined that there wasn't any particular value in answering, which would be rational in some sense. For me, it was more about confirming that I hadn't made an error or overlooked something or something to that effect. So I wouldn't draw too much in the way of conclusions around that.
Great, thank you, Sarah. There was also a question for you, Terry, on the status of the lawsuit. I feel like you mentioned that you filed the complaint and it's publicly available on your website. Other companies may be forthcoming. Is there just a word or two you might mention about the status of the lawsuit, whether there will be a hearing on this, and the timing related to your consumer campaign?
Yes, we agreed once it took a while for the 5 companies to, after we served them, to lawyer up, if you will, and they have. And then we agreed with all of the lawyers and the companies on a schedule. The companies are going to do a fairly typical move and move to dismiss the claim, saying that we haven't stated a legal claim that is viable against them. And so there is a briefing schedule set up. Once that was agreed to, we got new information despite the travel issues, and so I'm filing an amended complaint that adds more facts about the issues of forced labor and coercion, and that is due to be filed on June 26th in a couple weeks, and then the companies have a briefing schedule to then respond to the complaint. They have about, I think it's 60 days. So we will now be moving forward, and we will continue to post on our website any progress or developments in the case. In terms of the consumer case, we are discussing right as we speak with various partners around the world to try to figure out the best way to do that based on current events here in the United States in particular, with the Black Lives Matter protests and the virus issues. This isn't the best time to be launching a campaign, so we're going to wait till there's a little bit of breathing space in the media for us to do that. We've got some good media lined up and new photos that have come in from our co-workers.
Thanks so much, Terry. And Marcia, I believe you saw the question from David Schilling. Can you take that one on? Just to read the question from David at ICCR. First, welcoming Terry and Marcia to the line. Thank you both for being with us. And David's question, with the current Brazilian government, is the mobile monitoring unit still operating to investigate slave labor complaints?
Yes, hi David, miss you too. Yes, they are still working, but even now with the COVID and all this mobility, they make sure that, like in coffee, they have a team on the farms doing their inspections. So they have their budget, it's less than before, and they have less people than before. And the bureaucracy to take a decision and to approve the action plan, it's more slow. So this government now, it's make the inspection slowly. But this is still run. They are still working on this. And there is another question about if IRA and Impacto could make a paper to UN. Yes, we can do many papers necessary. We can share all the information that we have about the supply chain that we understand in Brazil, and then we can make a lot of stuff together. And we can make more calls like this with more time to understand some specific issues. I think it's important. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, noting the time, I'm going to just look to wrap up. I wanted to share one note of housekeeping about how to access the new report. It's online on our website, www.iasj.org. And we'll send it in the follow-up materials to the webinar, along with the video reference by Marcia about Impacto. And Terry will send a link to the complaint for the Cobalt case against the 6 companies. So everyone has access to that, along with the slides. And just want to say a huge gratitude to you, Sarah, for your excellent research and expertise in really diving in depth. And the report is extensive. It's 120 pages, so you can really dig in and get to know the automotive industry and its human rights impacts. There's also a condensed version that includes just a scorecard and highlights. But it is really a tool and a resource that we hope will help the companies we've been engaging to understand what good looks like and how they can move closer towards that. And what Terry and Marcia drove home so well is that this isn't just about policies on paper. This is really about people's lives, working conditions, keeping people healthy and safe at work, and ensuring that people have the right to live and work with dignity. And so we encourage all the companies covered in our engagement and throughout the sector to really examine their human rights due diligence and accelerate their efforts, because the impacts are quite severe and more is needed. So with that, thank you, Sarah, Terry, and Marcia so much for your time. And thanks to all the participants in the webinar. We had up to 90 participants representing companies, civil society, and stakeholders, and we really appreciate the opportunity to share this body of work with everyone. So thank you all, and stay well, and have a good day.